Now that we're recording the National Skills Coalition webinar, Federal Budget Analysis and Workforce Development Policy in 2016, I'll turn you over to our Federal Policy Director, Kermit Kaliba, and we can get started.
Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for being a part of the webinar today. We're really excited to have all of you joining us. As Nikki said, I'm Kermit Kaliba. I'm the Federal Policy Director here at National Skills Coalition. I'm joined today by Katie Spiker, our Federal Policy Analyst. We're pleased that you guys can be a part of our first Federal Policy webinar of 2016. We're going to be talking about the budget and workforce development policy. As folks know, the President just released the final budget of his administration last Tuesday. It's his budget setting his federal investment priorities for fiscal year 2017. And we wanted to, because there are a lot of elements in the budget that touch on workforce development and education, we thought it would be useful to sort of provide a little bit of background and information about what was contained in the budget and what some of the ideas that the President prioritized. We also wanted to take an opportunity to step back a little bit, reflect on some of the policy developments in workforce and education in 2015, and look ahead to some of the policy discussions that we think are going to be active in 2016. So if we can go to the next slide. And actually, let's go to the slide after that. I thought it might be helpful to just sort of step back before we get into the budget to talk a little bit about some of the developments that we saw in the workforce space in 2015. I think from the outside looking in, 2015 probably seemed less exciting than 2014. 2014, obviously, we had passage of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was a major event in the workforce space. It was, it had been 15 years in development. We finally got a reauthorization bill in a bipartisan fashion. 2014 also saw the passage of the agriculture bill, the farm bill, which included reauthorization and overhaul of the SNAP unemployment and training program. So from a legislative perspective, 2014 was a pretty exciting year. And so in 2015, there wasn't as much on the legislative space, but there was a lot that happened in 2015, and I thought it would be useful to sort of walk through very quickly some of the things that we saw, both on the administrative side and on the congressional side. So, obviously from the one of the big things that the administration was taking care of in 2015 or working on in 2015 was WIOA implementation. We'll talk about that more in a second, but I know that many folks on the call have been engaged at the state or the local level, both as advocates and in many cases in actually carrying out the requirements of WIOA implementation. And so you're very much familiar with how much that's been kind of an ongoing process across federal agencies, the Department of Labor, Department of Education, and others. We also saw in 2015 the release of the SNAP employment and training pilot grants. So these were grants that were authorized under the 2014 Farm Bill to support innovation and expansion of SNAP innovative strategies in the SNAP employment and training program. There were grants that were released to 10 states in 2015, and those grants are now in the process of ramping up and implementing. We saw the apprenticeship. We saw the administration place a great deal of emphasis on apprenticeship, on the idea of expanding apprenticeship, most notably through the release of the American Apprenticeship Initiative grants late last year. So they had originally announced $100 million in grant opportunities to expand apprenticeship across a range of different industries. They actually got so many good applications, so many fundable applications, that they increased the funding to $175 million over 46 grantees. And they really were, there's been, the administration has been doing a range of different activities around trying to expand the apprenticeship model and lift up the apprenticeship model, both through the funding side and also through technical assistance through the Office of Apprenticeship. And Katie will talk a little bit more about that later in the program. On the education side, on the higher education side, the administration had a number of different administrative initiatives One major initiative was the college scorecard that was released last summer. The college scorecard was a template for announcing or for showing employment and earnings data across a range of public post-secondary institutions for a set of students. It was a major step forward in trying to help us understand what institutions are doing a good job of connecting students to the labor market and helping them find family-sustaining jobs. We also saw the administration put a lot of emphasis on expanding access to the Pell Grant program through their experimental site authority. So folks may remember the administration over the summer announced their Second Chance Pell initiative, which is focused on individuals who are currently incarcerated, giving them access to Pell. And there was also a major initiative called the Equip Initiative, which was focused on expanding access to Pell to non-traditional sort of boot camps and other education providers working in partnership with educational institutions. The idea being to use the waiver authority that the administration has to test out some new ideas for how we expand access to new programs and new students that haven't been covered by the Pell Grant program. And last but not least, we saw the upskilling initiative, which is a major initiative early in 2015 where the administration was lifting up best practices across a range of employers and labor management partnerships in investing in the skills of frontline workers to support career advancement. So a lot of initiatives trying to sort of lift up the skills agenda, trying to create new opportunities within workforce and education, and testing out and innovating in new areas. On the congressional side, we didn't see as much explicit activity around workforce development, although we did see a number of, we did have a number of activities or a number of pieces of legislation that moved and other actions that Congress took to help sort of move the ball along. The first thing I'll note is the Bipartisan Budget Act. Folks may remember back in October, Congress and the administration reached a deal that is to suspend sequestration and to lift the budget caps in order to avoid a government shutdown. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but I did want to flag that this does have an impact on workforce and education because it increased the amount of funding that was available on the discretionary side of the budget, and it also helped reverse some of the cuts that we've seen under sequestration over the past 4 or 5 years. We saw the Every Student Succeeds Act pass. That's a bill that was a successor to No Child Left Behind. Not so much important from a workforce development perspective, but I think important from a tactical perspective. The committees that are responsible for passing Every Student Succeeds were the Senate Help Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee on the House side. The staff that were working on that bill are now, now that they've completed their work on that and it's passed by both sides of the aisle. Now they have some space to be working on other pieces of legislation that are more directly tied to post-secondary education and workforce. It also shows that there still continues to be some areas where Republicans and Democrats are able to come together around bipartisan legislation. So that went through fairly smoothly over the fall. And we have seen some activity laying the groundwork in Congress on a range of other policy discussions we'll talk about later in the webinar. We saw a number of hearings on Higher Education Act reauthorization. We saw a number of hearings on a couple of hearings on reauthorization of the Carl D. Perkins Act. And last but not least, we did get a couple of hearings around the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program reauthorization. So we'll talk about all of those a little bit later in the program. Can we move forward to the next slide? So it would not be a National Skills Coalition webinar if we didn't touch on WIOA implementation just briefly. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this. We have for folks who are interested in WIOA implementation, we actually have a range of resources and updates available on our website. I'll just flag a couple of things for folks to be aware of on the federal side. So as folks know, we're still waiting on the final regulations. The administering agencies, the Department of Labor, Education, HHS, and others were required by law to have the final regulations for WIOA published as of January of this year. They did announce in late January that they weren't going to be hitting the statutory deadline, and that they were going to be they were hoping to release the final regulations by June of this year. In that same announcement, they indicated that they will be delaying the submission date for state plans. State plans under WIOA are technically due March 3rd of 2016, or they were due March 3rd of 2016. The agencies indicated that they will be accepting state plans through April 1st of this year, that states will not be out of compliance if they submit by that later date of April 1st. And the reason why the rules have been delayed, or you know, the agencies have indicated that the rules have been delayed, is that they actually got so many comments on the notice of proposed rulemaking that was put out in April, and some additional regulatory material, administrative material that they put out around state plan guidance, state plan rules back in the summer, that they've actually, in order to respond to all of those comments appropriately, they need additional time in order to do that. So for those of you who are engaged in WIOA implementation, either as direct implementers of programs or as advocates who are working with the system, just a quick update on where we are with WIOA implementation. And as I said, we have a range of resources available on our website about the status of WIOA implementation. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at those resources, but I would do that after the webinar. If we go to the next slide. Sort of in thinking about what we're expecting in 2016, just sort of stepping back from the specifics of workforce policy, just sort of thinking more broadly about the political climate that we've got going on here in Washington. A couple of things to sort of note. So, you know, it's worth noting that the situation in the economy is significantly better than what it was 4 or 5 years ago. So we just got the national unemployment rate back in January was back down under 5% for the first time since 2008, which is great news. It means that the economy is, while the recovery has not been even across all populations and across all industries, what it does mean is that more people are going back to work, more employers are hiring, and so for our issues, that's a great position to be in. From an advocacy perspective, it's helpful to be talking about how do we solve a good problem, which is getting people the skills that they need to get emerging take advantage of job opportunities. The challenge with this is, of course, that from a policymaker perspective, the fact that we're not having to deal with a massive unemployment crisis means that there's less urgency around addressing some of the key policy priorities around workforce and education. And so while it's not a big problem to deal with, it is something to be aware of, that policymakers are looking at a range of different issues now, particularly as we lead into the elections. 2016 is also going to be the final year of the Obama administration. So so what that means from a practical sense, from a political sense, the administration, they recognize now that with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, we're not likely to see major new legislative developments from coming out of the administration that are likely to have much traction on the Hill. So much of the administration's attention now is moving towards messaging around legislative strategy, but also trying to start to focus on things that can be moved without congressional approval. So that's why you saw in 2015 some of the things that I talked about, the Pell experimental sites, for example, and the upskilling initiative and other strategies where they're able to make administrative choices or administrative policies without having to go through the congressional approval process. And I expect that we'll see more of that in 2016. And of course, last but not least, we have the 2016 elections coming up. And the main impact that has, of course, obviously there's a lot of political positioning going on, both at the presidential level and at the congressional level. From a practical standpoint, it also means that for the most part, Congress won't be taking up any major legislative actions after probably this summer, because they'll be transitioning full-time into electoral mode. So whatever could be on the dais in 2016 for legislative action probably has to happen in the next couple of months, or else it's likely to get pushed off into 2017. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk about the budget. Just a couple of things to sort of flag before we get into this. So I mentioned the Bipartisan Budget Act that was passed last October. The Budget Act, amongst other things, raised the discretionary budget caps for FY 2016 and 2017, and it also suspended sequestration for those years. So that's the budget baseline that Congress is supposed to be working from. We did see in 2016, we won't go into the details now, but we did see increases in funding in a number of different programs, including the WIOA Title I formula grant programs and Title II adult ed programs, and the end-of-year omnibus appropriations bill in FY16. So you can see that the lifting of the budget caps does have an impact on funding for workforce development programs. So it's important for us to continue to do advocacy. In FY17, right now, we're sort of, so we now have a new speaker in the House, Paul Ryan from Wisconsin, who replaced John Boehner of Ohio. And he has made it very clear that he is interested in trying to go back to a budget and appropriations process that reflects the way that the budget and appropriations process has looked historically, where you have a set of budget resolutions from the House and the Senate, and then individual appropriations bills work through the Appropriations Committee and then are passed. It's unclear if that's what's going to happen. Katie will talk a little bit about where things are with the politics around this, but that is sort of the where as we enter the appropriation cycle and as we think about the President's budget, that's kind of where we are with that conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk about what's in the budget.
Great, thanks, Kermit. So building off of what Kermit said, the President's budget request is an indication of what the administration's priorities are for the next year and on which the administration plans to focus in their last year in office. So while many of these proposals are unlikely to actually be funded, the Bipartisan Budget Act does give us a little bit more funding space for investments in skills. Overall, the FY 2017 presidential budget request proposes new investments in education and training. It renews some requests we've seen in previous presidential budget requests, including enhancing support for existing programs. It also, specifically, it adds some pretty substantial changes to the Pell Grant program. It calls for the Perkins Act reauthorization and TANF reauthorization, as well as increasing a pretty significant increase in funding for the TANF state block grant. The President also proposes investments in expanding apprenticeship, like Kermit mentioned, increasing funding for workforce data investments, and a focus on opportunity youth. So throughout the budget, the President really focuses on how we can expand skills training with this special focus on youth pretty frequently. So next slide. So specifically for the Department of Labor, the presidential budget request includes funding for WIOA Title I at authorized levels, which would be about $140 million above where it was funded for fiscal year 2016. It would also maintain the governor's reserve for statewide activities at 15%. The budget request would fund Wagner-Pizer at FY 2016 funding levels, but it would leave out a $400 million proposal that we saw in the 2016 request, which would have supported supplemental grants to states for intensive reemployment services. The request included $40 million in funding for the Workforce Data Quality Initiative, which was $34 million above what we saw funded in 2016. And the request renewed the President's call for expanding apprenticeship, including $90 million in funding, which is a repeat of what we saw Congress actually fund in 2016. Next slide. Like I said, there were significant new investments the President's budget proposed for youth. the $5.5 billion Opening Doors for Youth initiative would target job and skill training opportunities, including two separate parts. One, a $3.5 billion investment in formula funding for partnerships between employers and communities, with the goal to support up to 1 million summer job opportunities and 150,000 year-round work opportunities for out-of-school youth. The initiative would also include $2 billion in funding for a competitive grant program for communities that would be administered jointly between DOL and education. This initiative would focus on dropout recovery strategies. The President also requested $3 billion over 5 years for the American Talent Compact, with the goal to build on the administration's job-driven action plan. It would target regional partnerships to train workers to meet local employers' demand. The administration's proposal here would link these efforts to WIOA and focus on developing industry and sector training strategies. The compact would fund between 50 and 60 regions throughout the country a year to increase these collaborations between boards, employers, CTE programs, community colleges, economic development organizations. And then renewing his request from 2016, the President asked for $2 billion in funding to expand apprenticeship, again consistent with the administration's goal of doubling the number of apprentices in the country by 2019. This fund would be split into a new $200 million proposal targeting youth apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship that would require elements of both classroom and on-the-job training. And then the budget proposes using $1.3 billion of this funding for increasing state-led strategies, increasing the number of employers using apprenticeship, and $500 million targeting local and national partnerships to help support apprenticeship. And then finally, the President requested $500 million in mandatory funding to invest in tracking and updating data on workforce needs and trends throughout the country. The system is based on one that exists in HHS, the Open Health Data Initiative, and it would be a partnership between DOL and Department of Commerce. Next slide. So then moving on to the Department of Education, the administration's request was for $1.2 billion for CTE state grants, which is consistent with FY 2016 levels. The President's budget also included $75 million in funding to support the American Technical Training Fund, which is included in the President's 2016 budget request, but at $100 million. The request also calls for the reauthorization of Perkins, including $80 million in competitive grant funding for partnerships between local education agencies, institutions of higher education, businesses, and other entities to help support college and career readiness. The request proposed $582 million for adult basic and literacy education in state grants, which was consistent with our 2016 levels, and it called for $24.7 million for national leadership activities, which is an increase of $11 million over FY 2016 levels. And then finally, for Department of Education, the budget request, as I said, would make pretty significant changes to the Pell program by reinstating year-round Pell Grant eligibility, but it would cap the total available aid at 150% of the maximum award level. And then it would require eligibility for Pell. Participants would be required to complete full-time course load of 24 credits. The request encouraged students to accelerate their degrees by awarding a $300 Pell bonus to students participating in 15 credits a semester and 30 semester hours in the academic year. And then the President's budget request would lift the restrictions on providing Pell grants to incarcerated individuals, what Kermit mentioned, the Second Chance Pell proposal. Next slide. Under the Department of Health and Human Services, the President proposed $10 million in discretionary funding to establish a Systems Innovation Center that would work to improve interoperability between programs including TANF, child care, child welfare, SNAP. The President's proposal also included $50 million in mandatory funding to create a statewide human services data system grant program that would support states' management of longitudinal data. And then the President's budget included a request to increase the TANF overall state block grant by $8 billion over the next 5 years, and would require states to spend at least 55% of combined federal and state funds on core benefits, which would include work activities. The request would repurpose the current TANF contingency fund to do, among other things, establish a $473 million Pathway to Jobs initiative and invest $100 million in 2-generation demonstration projects. The budget also called for the establishment of a $2 billion TANF Economic Response Fund, which is similar to the TANF Emergency Contingency Fund we saw under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Next slide. So to put all those numbers in context, here you can see that over the past 5 years, as we've seen funding in some of these workforce programs decline, particularly here for WIOA Title I, so have the number of individuals that have been served under the program. As Kermit mentioned, the suspension of the budget caps in the Bipartisan Budget Act offers important space in this funding conversation to add resources back to the key workforce and training programs that we all advocate for. And the FY 2017 budget levels were set through the Bipartisan Budget Act, created this space, but in principle. So normally the next step in this process would be for the House and Senate budget committees to create a joint budget resolution. And what we hear is that some of the members of the conservative members of the House leadership are concerned with the level set in the Bipartisan Budget Act, and so they want to see further cuts below the numbers laid out there. And unless this debate's resolved in the next few weeks, it's pretty unlikely that we'll see a standalone labor HHS appropriations bill. Instead, it becomes more likely that we'll see another continuing resolution, an omnibus appropriation package, as the deadline approaches in the next throughout the year. So we will continue to monitor as these things happen. And then if we go to the next slide. Here's more reinforcement that for WIOA Title II in adult basic education, this chart shows that despite there being 36 million adults in the country with low basic skills, only 1.5 million are enrolled in federally funded ABE programs. So similar to the trends that we saw on the chart before, ABE investments have declined by 17% since 2010. So as the conversation around funding, the budget caps, the budget levels, and the appropriation process continues, we've seen a decline in the past few years, and so we're hoping that there's space for increases around these programs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kermit to continue.
All right, thank you very much, Katie. Yeah, you know, so I think that it's fair to say that the president's budget is, you know, as Katie said, we're not anticipating that everything that's in the president's budget proposal is going to be lifted up and taken up by Congress as part of the appropriations process. But, you know, the budget does do a good job of framing out some of the key policy discussions that are happening here in Washington and establishing a framework for how those conversations could happen, not just here in 2016, but also thinking ahead to 2017 and beyond. And so there's three policy discussions that I think are worth tapping into, or that we wanted to provide a status update on, and which are impacted in, you know, where the president's budget does have some positions. There's the Higher Education Act reauthorization. There's the Perkins Act reauthorization, and then last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about where things are with TANF. So starting with the Higher Education Act, so I think most folks on the phone are probably familiar with HEA. but it's the primary federal law that governs investments in post-secondary institutions, post-secondary credentials. One of the reasons why we particularly pay attention to it is the Title IV student assistance programs. So Title IV covers Pell grants and student loans and other forms of financial assistance that are targeted towards low and moderate income students, including working adults and non-traditional students who are trying to get access to skills and credentials to advance their careers and support their families. So the Higher Education Act was, the last major reauthorization of the law was back in 2008, although there were some significant changes in 2010. Coming into the beginning of last year, the beginning of the current congressional session, Senator Lamar Alexander, who is the chair of the Senate Health Committee, made clear that Higher Education Act reauthorization was his big priority. He's a former Secretary of Education, and he wanted to make sure he made it clear in his announcements that he really wanted to focus on trying to put his stamp on higher education policy in this country. And so we saw last year a series of hearings on the Health Committee around a range of different issues, and to their credit, they've been very ambitious about looking at all different aspects of higher education. So there were hearings on accreditation reform, hearings on student debt and affordability issues, hearings on this concept of risk sharing, which is the idea of asking asking institutions to have some skin in the game for student outcomes. We've had hearings on data reporting and how we make sure that we have transparency around how well higher education institutions are preparing people for the labor market. So there's been a lot of attention paid to the Higher Education Higher Education Act reauthorization. I think that in terms of where we are with the actual legislative process, when they started out this year, the hope is, as there often is, that there could be some bipartisan consensus around a comprehensive reauthorization bill heading into 2016. I think our sense now is that that's probably not quite where we're at, that it doesn't appear that there's sufficient consensus across all of the different issues that the Congress or that the senator was interested in tackling to be able to get to a full comprehensive bill in 2016. There's some possibility that we may see some smaller pieces move this spring, but as of right now, it looks like it does not appear that there's going to be a major reauthorization of HEA. So this conversation is likely to spill over into 2017. And certainly this is an area where many of the presidential campaigns are starting to weigh in on thoughts about how we make college more accessible, how we make college more affordable, how we make post-secondary credentials more accessible for a broader range of students. Can we go to the next slide? In terms of where we've been kind of paying attention, there's sort of two major areas where we have been focusing a lot of our energy and a lot of our attention, and that's around sort of rethinking how we fund federal financial assistance to make it more job-driven, particularly the Pell grant program. And then we've also been doing some work on the student outcomes and data reporting element of higher education reform. Let me just start, unpack these a little bit. So, the reason why we've been focusing on Pell grants and making them more accessible, particularly for short-term credentials. So, short-term credentials, industry-recognized credentials are a significant part of the higher education landscape. They make up about 1/4 of all undergraduate awards. And we know that there are a lot of non-traditional students and working adults who are pursuing shorter terms of post-secondary education, including not just associate degrees, but short-term certificates of 1 year or less, because those credentials are able to help them take advantage of emerging economic opportunities, job opportunities, or advance within their careers. Unfortunately, current policy around federal financial aid doesn't really support access to these shorter-term certificate programs. Right now, current law requires that in order to be eligible for either Pell or for federal loans, you have to be enrolled in a program that's at least 600, well, what are called clock hours, so essentially measures of seat time. And the reason behind that restriction originally was to make sure the emphasis was of the Pell Grant program originally was on helping low-income students get into longer-term four-year degrees. But we know that the labor market is changing. We know the post-secondary education landscape is changing. We know that student populations are changing, and so we think it's time to have a new conversation around expanding access to Pell to help students get the credentials they need to be successful in the labor market. If we go to the next slide, one piece of if we can go to the next slide, please. I did want to flag, one piece of legislation that has been introduced that would target this issue, or that could potentially target this issue, is a piece of legislation called the Jobs Act. This was a bill that was introduced by Senator Kaine and Senator Ayotte on the Senate side. It was introduced by Congressman Cedric Richmond of Louisiana on the House side last year, and this would expand access to Pell Grants for short-term programs that have industry recognition. So it would reduce the clock hour requirements for eligible programs from 600 hours down to 150 clock hours. But it would also require, from a quality assurance standpoint, would require that these be credentials that are approved by local or regional industries, and it includes language that would allow programs to be connected to basic skills instruction and connected to career pathways, including career pathways as defined under WIOA. So that's a piece of legislation that we're tracking right now. There's a couple of other pieces of legislation out there that are also seeking to expand access to post-secondary education for short-term credentials. There's a bill that Senator Tammy Baldwin and Congresswoman Tammy Duckworth of Illinois have introduced that would expand access to short-term credentials for federal loan programs. So that's an area where we think that this is an important area for Congress to be looking at. We do think it's time to rethink federal financial aid so that it is driven by the demands of the labor market and not just focused on 2- and 4-year degrees. If we go to the next slide. The other major area where we've been sort of paying attention to the reauthorization conversation is around data reporting. So this is really focusing on making sure that students and policymakers and institutions have adequate data about the employment and earnings and completion outcome from various institutions and various programs. There has been a lot of interest. There's a lot of groups that have been weighing in on this. One piece of legislation, if we could go to the next slide. One piece of legislation that we've been tracking is a piece of legislation called the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act, which was introduced by Senator Wyden of Oregon on the Senate side. And this is a bill that would amend the Higher Education Act to require reporting on employment and earnings outcomes for all students, for all post-secondary students. It would mandate that data be disaggregated by program and student characteristics. So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that the administration put out their college scorecard. One of the drawbacks of the college scorecard is that it only does reporting by institutional level, so it doesn't dig down into the specific programs of study and the employment and earning outcomes from programs of study. So the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act would tackle that. Last but not least, it would create a national student record system that helps link to employment data. One of the things, so there's current law. There's a prohibition on the creation of a national student record system that would allow. So right now, institutions, the federal government is only able to collect data on certain student population, students that are able to, or that are tapping into federal financial aid. This would allow, the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act would allow the federal government to do reporting across a broader range of students so that we have better information about what programs are working and which programs are not. Okay. We can move on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Carl D. Perkins Act. So the Perkins Act, many folks on the call are probably familiar. The Perkins Act is the nation's primary program or primary law governing career and technical education programs. And it's, these are state formula grants. The primary focus of the program is state formula grants that can be used both at the secondary level and at the post-secondary level. States have fairly broad discretion in how they want to allocate those dollars between secondary systems and post-secondary systems. The law was last reauthorized in 2006, and so it is overdue for reauthorization. Where the conversation has been around, at both the national organizational level and then the congressional level, where the conversation has been focused. We've been focusing, there's been a lot of focus on the concept of programs of study. Programs of study, I think the best way to sort of think about it, these are 2+2 models where secondary and post-secondary systems are aligned so that you take 2 years worth of secondary programming in a particular sector or industry, and they're able to transition directly into 2 years of post-secondary instruction at an eligible institution. This was a concept that was included in the 2006 authorization. States are required to have some programs of study, but not all not all Perkins dollars have to be aligned with a program of study. I think there's been some interest in moving more towards making programs of study the default model under Perkins so that there's greater alignment between secondary and post-secondary systems. With the passage of WIOA, there's been a great deal, and also to a lesser extent the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, there's been a lot of discussion around outcome measures under Perkins. So the Perkins does have outcome measures, but they are not consistent with the outcome measures under WIOA. They're not consistent with the outcome measures under the newly passed Every Student Succeeds Act. And so there has been some discussion about, we know that Perkins is an important partner in the workforce system and in education systems, so some discussion around whether or not it makes sense to better align outcomes across those programs, so moving more towards either the WIOA or the ESSA performance outcome measures to make it easier for those programs to be aligned. There's also been a lot of interest in greater investment in innovation. So the Perkins Act has lost about 14% of its funding, the state grant program, since fiscal year 2010, one of the many programs that's been subject to budget cuts over the past 5 years. And as a result, there's been, I think, a perception that that school districts, both at the secondary level and post-secondary institutions, have been struggling to sort of ramp up and invest in new and innovative program partnerships with industry and other stakeholders. So I think there is a fair amount of interest in figuring out how we can put more money into those kind of innovative strategies. If we could go to the next slide. The reason why we've been focusing on Perkins Act reauthorization, the reason why we think it matters, Perkins was one of the partner programs that was identified under WIOA that could be part of a state unified or a combined plan. WIOA clearly intended for a range of programs that have not often been well integrated with the workforce system. There was a clear intention that that all of these different federal programs start to work together more effectively. We know that there are a number of states that, as part of their draft state plans, have indicated either through the unified planning process or through a combined planning process that they intend to better integrate their Perkins investments with their Title I and Title II WIOA investments. So we do think it's important to make sure that as part of the reauthorization process for Perkins, that some of the lessons that we've learned through that planning process are integrated so that it's easier for folks at the state and the local level to integrate these programs and align these programs and align activities more effectively. Perkins post-secondary programs, as they were under WIA, are a mandatory partner at the local level. So again, trying to make sure that when we think about how funds are used at the local level, that there is some sort of there is better collaboration across the partners. And then, of course, Perkins funds, Perkins is not tuition money. It funds capacity building at secondary, post-secondary institutions. But as it is money that can help support, and certainly certainly at the post-secondary level, Perkins-funded institutions are identified directly or indirectly as key partners in the implementation of sector partnerships and career pathways under WIOA. So again, we think it's important as part of the Perkins conversation as we move forward to make sure that we're building in some of the best practices and the lessons that we've learned from WIOA, both from the legislation itself, but also some of the lessons that we've learned from state and local planning over the last year and a half, so that we are better integrating all of these different investments to support the needs of workers and to make sure that industry is also having their needs met. If we could move to the next slide. I will just flag one piece of legislation that we're tracking that isn't explicitly part of the Perkins conversation, but there has been some discussion around it, is the Community College to Career Fund Act. This is a piece of legislation that was introduced by Senator Al Franken of Minnesota. He actually introduced it in previous sessions as a potential amendment to WIA or WIOA, but he's now seeking to have it included as part of the conversation around Perkins Act reauthorization. This is a bill that would support grants for partnerships between colleges, community colleges, employers, and other stakeholders. We know that community colleges and technical colleges and other stakeholders have been doing a lot of really fantastic work through a range of different investments over the past few years, including the TACT grants, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training grants, which just expired in 2014. There's been a range of other funding, a range of other grants that have been investing in ramping up community, college, and industry partnerships. We know under WIOA, industry partnerships are a core strategy that states and local areas are supposed to be implementing. So we think that legislation like this would be incredibly helpful to both lift up and carry on some of the work that we've already seen, but also to help support WIOA as workforce boards and other stakeholders are working to build industry and sector partnerships and develop career pathways. Providing dedicated funding to help support those activities would be an important addition to the conversation. And certainly, the administration in their budget did call for, as Katie mentioned, some investments in sector partnerships, direct investments in sector partnerships, but we also want to make sure that we're exploring other avenues and seeking to make continue investments in all of the different stakeholders who can contribute to these strategies. So next slide. And the last thing I want to talk about, and then we want to give folks an opportunity to ask some questions, I'll just touch briefly on the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program and where things are with that. So, as I think many folks know, TANF was originally passed back in 1996. It's been as part of the welfare reform movement. It was last major reauthorization, last major changes to the bill were back in 2005. And I think that as many folks on the call probably know, TANF was designed as a work-first program, right? The idea was to focus on trying to connect TANF recipients, focusing on rapid labor market attachment, and so the law as it's currently structured actually sort of disincentivizes states and providers from focusing on training and education for TANF recipients. There's restrictions on the number of people who are the number of recipients who can count towards a state's work participation rate if they're participating in training. There are restrictions on the length of training that TANF recipients can be in. There are other disincentives for states to be focused on training and education for TANF recipients. And that's been a challenge, as folks probably know, that WIOA, much with Perkins, WIOA clearly signals that TANF should be more closely integrated with the broader workforce and education system in this country. But in order to get to that point, there are some policy changes that would need to be made to make it easier for states and providers to work with TANF recipients to help them get the skills and the credentials they need to be successful in today's labor market. There was a draft bill that was a discussion draft, I should say, that was released by the House Ways and Means Committee last summer, and it actually was a surprisingly positive bill in terms of changing the nature of workforce and education restrictions. So there were a number of proposals around lifting some of the existing restrictions on who can be in training and how long they can be in training. There was a proposal in there to allow states greater flexibility around measuring earnings and employment outcomes. So right now under TANF there are no outcome measures that are collected or no accountability measures around the outcomes, employment outcomes and earning outcomes for recipients. So allowing states to transition so that they could focus more on whether or not they were actually meeting the long-term employment needs of folks who are rolling off of TANF. There was also a set of proposals around changing the current contingency fund, which is sort of an existing fund for a set of states that, based on labor market conditions and caseload conditions back in the mid-90s, repurposing some of that money to invest in some innovative pilot programs, including, not limited to, but including investments in career pathways and workforce development strategies. So it wasn't a perfect bill. There were some, it didn't make it didn't go quite as far as we would have liked in terms of increasing the overall funding for TANF and moving away from sort of the process-oriented outcomes. But it was a good positive, it was a good step in the right direction, we thought. It's not clear what the status of the reauthorization process is right now. Certainly, as Katie mentioned, there is a proposal in the President's budget around reauthorization of TANF, which includes a lot of the changes, which mirrors some of the changes that were proposed in the discussion draft. So it does seem like there could be some room for bipartisan discussion. On the other hand, there has been some discussion as part of the budget negotiations that are happening, particularly on the House side. There's been some interest in potentially moving towards sort of a broader welfare reform discussion where Congress would think about expanding or creating a block grant program that would consolidate a range of different means-tested anti-poverty programs, including Medicaid, the SNAP program, TANF, and others. There has been some interest from particularly on the House side, in potentially trying to move a reconciliation bill or some other piece of legislation that would consolidate all of those programs into a single state block grant to give states greater flexibility. So one of the things that we're going to be monitoring in 2016 is whether or not Congress decides to take up TANF reauthorization on its own, or whether or not they see moving more towards consolidation. And as many folks in the field know, we're always trying to be careful about consolidation conversations because of the concerns about where we see the funding going, and making sure that any discussion around changing these programs doesn't lead to diminished services for target populations. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop there because I know that we're coming to the end of our time, and we wanted to provide an opportunity for questions. So if we could skip ahead to the next slide, I'll just flag. So the reason why we've been paying attention to TANF as part in the policy discussions around TANF, TANF is a significant is a program that's intended to help low-skilled individuals and should be helping them better connect to well-paying, family-supporting jobs. Unfortunately, as we talked about, there are all these restrictions around training and education, and as a result, the resources that are available under TANF aren't being used particularly to support education and training at the level that we think they should. So this is a conversation that we're going to continue to monitor through 2016. But we think it is, as with many of these other conversations, there is hopefully an opportunity for Congress to really start to think about how all of these different federal programs work together and align to support the needs of job seekers and support the needs of businesses and communities across the country. So I'm going to stop there, and then I know we have some questions. So Katie, why don't we go ahead and answer some questions?
Great. So we do have a few. I'll encourage folks to submit any others that you have while we go through the first one or two. There were a few questions on TANF, which could have been because we got to it at the end of the slide, but I'll start with one of the first that was asking for more details on the Pathways to Jobs initiative. So the Pathways to Jobs initiative in the President's budget request was $473 million. It would be used to support subsidized employment. It could cover up to 100% of wages, benefits, training, administrative costs that would go through the first 90 days of employment, and it would include summer employment. So that's one of the new proposals in the President's budget on TANF. We also had a couple other questions asking about how the alignment through TANF reauthorization with WIOA could be prioritized. I know you talked a little bit about this, but did you want to go into any more detail along TANF and WIOA alignment?
Sure, and I should say that when the Ways and Means Committee released their discussion draft back in July, we did submit comments to the committee with our recommendations around what we would have liked to see out of the bill. In terms of stronger alignment, I think there's a couple of areas where we think TANF could be strengthened as part of a reauthorization process to make it easier. So one area, of course, and I talked about this a little bit, is around the outcome measures for TANF. Right now TANF is the only real performance measure that states have is what's called the work participation rate, and the work participation rate really is just a measure of how many, what percentage of eligible TANF recipients are engaged in a set of activities, whether it's unsubsidized employment, subsidized employment, education and training. There's a range of other activities that are defined under the law. But there's currently no measure of whether or not, when people transition off of TANF assistance, whether or not they are transitioning into well-paying jobs, jobs that help them, and whether or not they're staying in well-paying jobs, and what those earnings are. And so as we think about how you could reauthorize TANF to make it to better align with WIOA and some of the work that folks are doing at the state and the local level under that law, one thing that we did recommend was that Congress consider whether or not it would be possible to give states flexibility, at a minimum to give states flexibility to start to shift towards tracking those outcomes and determining determining whether or not their programming is effective, whether or not they're serving the needs of TANF clients by meeting performance accountability around earnings and outcomes and some of the other outcome measures that are included in WIOA. Some of the other things that I'll note with TANF reauthorization. So there's currently there's a cap on the amount of time that individuals in TANF are allowed to participate in what's called vocational educational training. So under current law, you're only allowed, there's a lifetime limit of 12 months of vocational educational training that TANF recipients are allowed to participate in and still qualify towards the overall work participation rate. We have long advocated for lifting that restriction because, one of the reasons is we know that the vast majority of TANF recipients don't have any post-secondary education. As of right, the most recent fiscal year that we have data for, less than 7% of TANF recipients have any education beyond the high school level. And in an economy where as many as 80% of all new job openings are going to require some form of post-secondary education, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to place these sort of arbitrary time restrictions on participation in education and training when, particularly when you're talking about folks who may not, who may have basic skills deficits and would need a longer-term intervention, whether it's enrollment in Title I programming, Title II adult ed programming. Right now, there's a limit on how TANF recipients engage in education and training, and so we would encourage Congress to think about, as part of the reauthorization process, eliminating those restrictions and making it easier for training providers and adult education providers and others to work with those clients in a way that doesn't impact their eligibility and doesn't create challenges for states from an accountability standpoint. And the other thing I will say is, just in general, in thinking about, the overall funding for TANF. TANF is it's a block grant program. It's been funded at the exact same level, about $16.6 billion since 1996. One of the things that means is that when you adjust for inflation, the purchasing power of TANF has gone down by about 30%, over the 35% over the last 20 years. And so, as we think about TANF reauthorization, making sure that there are sufficient resources to make sure that folks are, make sure that that states have the resources they need to make sure that benefits are available for TANF recipients, making sure that there's sufficient resources to invest in work-related activities and education and training. We think that would also help with integration across these programs. So there's a couple of things. I mean, there are other recommendations that we have made, but I think those are some of the key things that we would focus on.
Great. So we have another question about any insight that NSC has about the top priorities with the administration's budget. Is there any of all the things that we touched on, anything that the administration will particularly focus on trying to achieve?
Well, so, I think the administration is, what they're trying to do with their budget is signal that there's a range of different issues that they're interested in tackling. I do think that in terms of what's feasible or what I think is realistic, that again, the administration's budget is not likely to be lifted up as a whole by a Republican House and a Republican Senate. It's not likely that a lot of these big proposals will be taken up, but I do think that there are some areas where certainly Congress has indicated that they are interested in potentially working with the administration. I think the fact that the administration called for authorized funding levels for the formula grant programs is an important step. The administration in the last two budgets has not called for authorized funding levels for the formula grant programs. And so the fact that they did call for the authorized grant levels shows that they do recognize and they are interested in making sure that there are sufficient resources at the state and the local level for WIOA implementation. And when last year, as part of the omnibus, the appropriations bill at the end of the year, there was Congress did ultimately adopt the president's budget requests for the formula grant programs, adult ed, and the Title I programs. So the fact that the President has called for authorized levels does mean that there is some room for Congress to, within the limited budget authority that they have next year, that there is some room for them to continue to increase funding for the formula grant programs. I think certainly the administration has signaled that they're very interested in expanding access to Pell across a range of different populations, including year-round Pell, so making sure that that low and moderate income students who want to who need a second award in order to participate in summer or engage in summer programming or accelerated education. They have signaled that that's an important priority, and they included funding for that. There has been, I think there's Senator Alexander on the Help Committee has also signaled that he sees year-round Pell as something that he can support as part of an HEA reauthorization package. And so while, again, we don't see HEA reauthorization, a comprehensive bill, as being likely, it is possible that we might see that included either as part of a smaller piece of legislation or as part of the appropriations process later on in the year. And then, certainly the administration has been did request funding around apprenticeship. That was one of the surprising things that came out of the omnibus bill in 2016, in FY 2016, was that Congress did create this new $90 million line item for apprenticeship grants. And the administration has once again requested funding for apprenticeship of about $90 million. And so I do think that there is, at least while it's hard to predict what's going to happen with the appropriations process, it does seem to indicate that Congress is comfortable with apprenticeship as a new sort of funding line, a new discretionary funding line. So the administration, I think, is signaling that they're very interested in moving across a range of different conversations, whether it's new investments in youth, new investments in sector partnerships, new investments in workforce development opportunities for TANF recipients. They certainly were trying to signal a range of different areas where they saw opportunities for Congress to take action. But I think in terms of what's realistic and what's likely to happen, those are probably the areas where we would see the most, there's probably the greatest likelihood of movement in the next year. But look, we will certainly be pushing for bigger changes and more congressional action and additional funding across all these different programs and all these different priorities as we move forward through the appropriations process, and we'll do our best to keep folks linked in, not just in terms of giving status updates around the appropriate budget and appropriations process, but also identifying areas where advocates can be weighing in with Congress and with the administration where appropriate around not just the funding conversation, but also the policy conversations. We want to make sure that folks in the field, you folks are the ones who are responsible for administering these programs and making sure that that job seekers are able to get the skills they need and businesses are able to get the skilled workforce that they need in order to be competitive. And we want to make sure that your voices are lifted up as part of the policy conversation moving forward. So I think we have time for just one more question because I know we're a little bit over time. So why don't we go to one last question?
Sure. So we've got a question on Title II funding.
Okay.
So when we see increases in other titles of WIOA funding in the President's budget request, why did we not see an increase in Title II funding?
So that's a fair question. I think that to be honest, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I do think that I will note that the administration is calling for funding at the levels that were approved in the 2016 omnibus, which is a slight increase over the previous year's levels. So at least we are seeing, while we're not seeing calls for major increases, there is at least an interest in funding at current levels and not going back down to prior levels. I do think that from an advocacy perspective, though, you know, it's important for folks who are folks at the state and the local level to, you know, when we're talking to policymakers, when we're going up on the Hill, or when we're sending letters to policymakers, to make sure that we're weighing in for where we think the resources need to be. I know that we will hopefully in the next couple of weeks, National Skills Coalition is going to be we'll be putting out some additional materials on the budget and appropriations process, including some tools to help advocates weigh in on funding levels with Congress as they begin the budget and appropriations process. And we will certainly be calling for increased investments in Title II adult education programs. And so we would encourage folks to use those tools and to be weighing in with their policymakers. And I do think as we sort of transition into the 2016 and 2017, we have spent the last 4 or 5 years sort of fighting against budget cuts. We've done I think as good a job as we can in terms of weathering budget cuts and continuing to weigh in with Congress about the appropriate funding levels. We are now sort of, it looks like we're kind of past the point where we're going to be dealing with sequestration as a significant barrier. So Congress has, suspended sequestration for the last 4 fiscal years. So I think that there's less of an interest on the Hill in significant budget cuts, but I think it's important for us to take advantage of this opportunity as advocates and be weighing in with policymakers and letting them know that just because we're not cutting funding in the way that we used to be, that doesn't mean that the work is done. We still need to be making sure that we're investing adequate resources across all workforce and education programs to make sure that job seekers can get the skills and the credentials they need to be successful in today's labor market, and to make sure that businesses can find the skilled workforce, right? When, one of the things that we know is as unemployment goes down, as businesses begin to ramp up and are hiring, we are now seeing, hearing more and more from business leaders about skills gaps and the inability to find skilled workers to fill positions that they have. That's becoming, as more people go back to work, you're going to start to see more of this. This is more of an issue. So now is the time to be weighing in with policymakers and saying, this is the time when we need to be investing in skills. There are people who could be taking advantage of these new job opportunities. If we could get them into the programming, get them the credentials they need, this is the opportunity to be engaging with employers to help them fill their skill needs. So I do want to encourage folks, and again, we'll put out materials, and other folks will be putting out materials as well. But it's important to keep weighing in with policymakers, with appropriators, and with others to let them know just how important this issue is. That it hasn't gone away just because we've gotten through the big budget cuts under 2011 and 2010 and 2011. Now is the time to be ramping up those investments and taking advantage of the flexibility that the new budget deal has given us. So we really want to hammer that point home with lawmakers moving forward. Okay, so, and I want to say, so I know that we have a lot of other questions. We are substantially over time. So what I wanted to say is we will take a look at all of the questions that were submitted, and we will try to, we'll be posting the slides and the recording of this webinar on our website. Hopefully by tomorrow. We will also take a look at the questions, and we will try to, if we can't get back to you directly with answers to your questions, we will try to post an FAQ document in the next couple of days with responses to your questions. So with that, thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you so much for listening. And if folks have questions that we didn't answer, you are more than welcome to reach out to myself or reach out to Katie, and we will do our best to answer your questions directly. So thanks for joining us today, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Nikki.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. Like Kermit said, we're going to have the recording of the webinar and the slide deck and a Q&A up on our website just as soon as that's possible. You can find that at www.nationalskillscoalition.org, and then you can navigate to webinars. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.